For the last two videos, Harley and I, say hello Harley, have been debating what's going wrong with our approach to fighting climate change. And for this video, I want to focus on what actually might work. So to recap, we've spent trillions on trying to fight climate change and have barely moved the needle on how much of our energy is produced from non-carbon sources. And last year was a record year for emissions. In fact, they've gone up 70% over the last 3.5 decades. So rather than just go on about how bad things are, what are the solutions we should be looking at? Well, firstly, we have to recognise one very important truth. We cannot hit net zero with our current technology. We do not have the resources. That's not being negative or defeatist. The maths show us it's not possible. In fact, we can't even get close. And that means that you have to be ruthless in how you optimise the use of those resources to give the best bang for the buck in terms of carbon reduction. And that brings us on to one very simple principle, one question. What will maximise the reduction in emissions or emissions avoidance for every unit of resource that we deploy, whilst maintaining sufficient economic strength to fight the fight? That's it, nice and simple. And if you were to take all our current strategies and measure it against that question, you'd find them all wanting. So what are the strategies we should deploy that actually fit? Let's talk about the constraints first that force this need to be ruthlessly optimizing things. First and foremost, we do not have the resources to hit net zero. If we start with the simple raw materials, so that's carbon, molybdenum, chromium, nickel, steel, aluminium, for all those raw materials, and there's a list of about 20 of them, we have to increase our production, in some cases 20-fold, in order to meet net zero. And we don't even have enough known reserves in the ground to do that, never mind the current mining capacity. And we don't have the manpower or the finances to actually build the mines to dig it up. Let's assume that we could for a second. We can't, but let's assume we could. We don't have the material processing to turn the ore into useful materials to actually make things. And if we did, then the energy requirements would be so massive we couldn't power them. And if we could fix all those things, we don't have the industrial capacity, the factories, to make the things we need. The solar farms, the wind turbines, the generators, the load balancers, the electric vehicles. We just don't have that capacity or the people to man them. So all in all, we can barely get probably 10-50% of the way there. So that's the first constraint. The second constraint is that we cannot get to net zero with our current technology, but we might with the next technology. But that requires massive investment, and that requires strong economic growth to throw up the wealth to do so. And so much of what we do to fight climate change now actually destroys wealth and makes it much more difficult to fund the research to do so. And both of those things are arising because in public debate, as soon as you mention them, you get shouted down. Whether that's by politicians who want to look good or campaigners who think that we need to have hair-shirt policies where we actually feel some pain in order to meet net zero, because that's the good, proper, right way to do it, because it's our fault in the first place. If that's how you feel, fine, but it doesn't really help. The first pillar of the right way to fight climate change is to fix the accounting. You cannot manage what you cannot measure, and you certainly can't optimize it. The current way that we account for carbon emissions on a territorial basis simply incentivizes countries to export them rather than properly do something about them. Look, our emissions are going down. Brilliant, but you've just actually increased them across the world. And I gave 2 examples of that in the last video. So in order for us to be able to actually optimize, we have to move away from a territorial-based emissions measurement and actually look at consumption. The things that we actually use all the way back through the supply chain, what is the actual carbon cost, and is there a better way of doing it? And if we did that and accounted for it properly, we would have very, very different policies. You would actually onshore certain manufacturing, because where it's made right now, if you add in all the carbon costs, has a very high carbon footprint. And if we onshored it, even if it was powered by gas for the energy, it would have a lower carbon emission. But because we don't measure correctly, nobody does it. And no government will, because their numbers go up. So what we need is a system whereby that is properly captured. And I mean properly, because at the moment, even Western countries are being dishonest. Take Germany, for example. They have a lot of renewables because the sun doesn't shine brilliantly in Germany. They need a backup source, and that backup source is largely powered by coal. And if you can't wind up a coal power station quickly, basically it takes almost a whole day to get it up to the heat necessary to power the turbines. And you need to be able to balance load very quickly if you're using renewables. So essentially, their carbon emitting power stations are on 100% of the time. But they only account for that carbon when it's actually transmitting electricity. If their renewables are doing enough, it doesn't get counted for in the numbers. That's dishonest and distorting. Same with China. Their numbers look suspiciously good for emissions per megawatt hour produced, and it's probably down to either poor methodology or just plain cheating. And once you've got all that data collected correctly, you then need a mechanism for trading it. The EU have made a good start. Doesn't go far enough, but until we get that going, we can't fix the problem. The first question to ask if you're following an optimization strategy for fighting climate change is what provides maximum displacement? And by that I mean, what will displace the most amount of carbon either currently being produced or that will be produced if you don't do something for the minimum amount of resources? Now, that resource could be money spent, which is an important resource. It could be copper, it could be aluminium, it could be nickel, it could be silicon, it could be manpower, it could be time, it could be land. Whatever the resource is, what will provide you with the maximum displacement? And if you look at that calculation, a huge amount of the things that we do, we wouldn't do because they don't provide the maximum displacement. Converting, say, a dirty coal power station in the third world to a clean gas powered station, still fossil fueled, has a massive impact on reducing CO2. But we don't support it, we don't finance it because it still uses fossil fuels, even though on a purely arithmetic basis, it's a good idea. And the same amount of money we spend on, say, subsidising loft installation in the UK only delivers a fraction of the saving in emissions. So it's not the right thing to do if you're looking to optimise. And there are countless examples of this all over the world. And it's true that most of the maximum opportunities for displacement are in the third world, not in the rich world, because we've largely done a pretty good job at making our own grids fairly efficient. The amount of emissions that we kick out for every megawatt hour of energy produced are fairly low compared to much of the third world. So trying to make ours even more efficient is a poor use of resources. What we should be doing is helping the third world to make theirs more efficient and to avoid them building coal plants rather than putting in more efficient gas plants or indeed renewables. However, this is politically difficult. Politicians do not like to tell their electorate that they're sending money overseas. And also it means that from the accounting perspective again, they won't be able to show that on their balance sheet. So again, you must fix the accounting, and we have to have a proper discussion with our populations, with our voters, to explain that the way we're doing things doesn't work. The other part of maximum displacement is maximum prevention. It is much, much cheaper not to build a coal power station and build something more efficient in the first place than it is to build the coal power station and then try and replace it. And at the moment, most of that activity is taking place in the third world. Why? Because, as I mentioned before in the other video, poor people do not like being poor, and part of being poor is not having access to energy. And if we try and impose first world standards of what net zero means on third world countries, they will laugh in our faces and just go build coal power plants because they can't afford the kind of infrastructures that we have. Therefore, if we want to avoid adding more carbon emissions, we need to help the third world to add energy that is efficient. And sometimes that will mean adding a gas power plant, which is much more efficient than a coal one. And if we don't spend some of the money doing that, then the total emissions in the third world will go up faster than we can reduce them in the first world, which really doesn't help. The next pillar is nuclear. In this country, we have ignored nuclear for 30 years. As a result, the supply chains, the skill sets, they've all atrophied to nothing. All the people who know how to do them have either retired or died. And if we want to get it going again, it's going to cost us money. But that's entirely our own fault. There is no technical or economic reason why we couldn't have built nuclear, and politicians of all colours need to take some blame for that. Without something like nuclear in this country, we're never going to get close to net zero. All we've done is export our emissions, and because we've insisted on being a renewables first strategy, we've loaded ourselves with incredibly high costs, which is going to continue. Where we should have actually sent those renewables to other places where they will do maximum displacement. So politicians need to get their finger out, make the case, and instead of doing bespoke one-off nuclear reactors, actually put a program together to build half a dozen, so that we can mimic what has been achieved in South Korea, and France and other places, and the strategy that Finland is now currently trying. Nuclear is an example of a current technology that's useful in fighting climate change. But we cannot beat climate change, we cannot get to net zero with our current technology. We therefore have to invest massively in research and development. We have to improve efficiencies of current renewables. We have made massive gains in the efficiency of solar panels, and we can make more. We need to invest in how we can make grids more reliable, how we can improve load balancing so that having a renewable grid is actually more safe. We don't have instances like happened in Spain, where their entire grid went down for 3 days. We need to invest in battery technology, because our current battery technology cannot help us at scale. The most we can store energy for is 4 hours, and we need to be able to store energy for days. And we don't have the resources to be able to make those batteries anyway, and things like lithium are a really poor choice in terms of their environmental impact. So we need more research into that. We need more research into nuclear. Yes, our current nuclear options are good, but they could be so much better, whether that's small modular reactors or different chemistries beyond just uranium and plutonium. All this requires pure research, and governments are best suited to fund it. So what they should be doing, instead of doing subsidies for renewables, all that money should be funding research into the technologies of tomorrow. Then if there are any promising outcomes of that technology, it should be licensed to whoever wants to use it at a reasonable price, so that industry can be the ones to develop the actual products that we would use, which would reduce our emissions and get us closer to net zero. And that brings us on neatly to a really, really important point. One of the biggest problems we have with our current climate policy is that it's led by governments, and governments are really, really bad at spending money. In the UK, the government has dictated that the solution for the UK is renewables. Now, I'm sure renewables are part of the mix, but by dictating that, it's distorted the marketplace. We have spent money we didn't need to. We have exported emissions we shouldn't have. We have ignored the biggest tool that we have, which is nuclear. Whereas if the government has simply said, this is the goal what we're trying to achieve, this is the emissions per kilowatt hour produced, for instance, and then moved over to the industry to sort out, we'd be in a lot better position. And we see it time and time again. In Sweden, there was a battery facility called Northvolt, which was reduced. The EU was worried about the dominance of China in the battery space, and so 15 billion euros was invested, 5 billion which was public money, and so you have a political project that eventually went bankrupt because it was not sound business or technical sense. And now we have a position where China is even stronger in that space. Whereas if they simply funded research into battery technology and then licensed it, then you could see that battery technology being used all over the world and everyone benefited from it. So when governments of any type try to dictate or choose or pick winners, they normally get it wrong, and they're really, really poor at efficiently spending our money. Which brings us back to the optimisation point, is that we have to make sure that every penny we spend or every euro we spend is done wisely to give the maximum effect. All of that said, governments of course still have a role. Markets are not perfect, and occasionally they throw off imbalances. Some players get too strong and you get monopolies occurring. And in those instances, governments need to step in. They need to make sure that technology where it's funded by public money is available publicly. Governments need to set the objectives and let industry get on with the rest. Very simply, if a company invests Unwisely, they make a loss and the shareholders kick up a fuss and people will lose jobs. If the government spends money unwisely, they don't care. It's not their money. And that is the fundamental difference between the two, and why in a resource-constrained world where every penny and every resource needs to be applied and optimised, governments are a bad choice. The final pillar is normally the one that generates the most heated debate, and that is that if we accept that we cannot hit net zero with our current technology, because we can't, then what do we do about the rising temperatures and climate change? Because, and we have to accept this, some change is inevitable, and that means mitigation and adaptation. It means, for instance, that we need to work on carbon capture. If we can't stop all carbon, we have to capture it before it gets into the atmosphere. In some cases where we can't capture it, or where the effect of climate change is going to be felt regardless, how do we adapt to it? The Netherlands have been doing it for centuries with water and land management, and admitting it is not a weakness. Now, I know there are many amongst the activists who say that any kind of mitigation or carbon capture is an excuse to have carry on emitting carbon. It's not. It's just sensible. And it buys time. It buys time for the investment in R&D to produce the technologies which do allow for net zero. It also secures economic wealth. It ensures that we are generating the wealth to fund the effort. And much of the pain from climate change is going to be felt in the third world. And if we don't put mitigation in place, what happens is chaos in those places as they get damage from storms, rising tides, whatever. And a chaotic country is one that tends to produce more carbon because there's less centralized control and less efficient grids and energy management. So we need to have an honest conversation about adaptation and mitigation. And that starts with politicians admitting to all of us that we cannot hit net zero and stop pretending that we can. So there you have it. An inescapable truth: we cannot hit net zero with current technology. A framework we need to follow, which is that we need to maximize the reduction in emissions for every unit of resource while maintaining our economic strength. And our multiple pillars: fix the accounting so that we can do what's right, not what is seen to be right. Maximum displacement so that we can optimize where we put our limited resources. Maximum prevention so we stop high emitting energy production taking place in the first place rather than try and replace it later, which is more costly. Invest in R&D for the technologies that might allow us to get to net zero. Governments to get out of making decisions about what we do and instead fund the R&D and let the markets do their jobs. Work on mitigation and adaptation so that we buy ourselves time and strengthen our economies. And most of all, be honest with our populations that we cannot hit net zero, and all our attempts to do so are making things worse. Now, I'm sure I'm going to get lots of people coming at me in the comments. Please do try and keep it polite, and let's have a good debate. Ta-ra for now.